From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading promotion arm of the library. And we promote books and reading and literacy in libraries in many different ways and in many different places. There are centers for the book in all 50 states, plus DC, plus the new one in the Virgin Islands. At that local level, they promote books and reading, often by celebrating local literary heritages, working with local authors. We also have a major role to play in the U.S. National Book Festival, which will be held this year. Our 10th anniversary is September the 25th. And I'm just from a morning meeting about the book festival, trying to figure out how we can actually move ahead on the website. We're working hard on the website, and at least we don't even quite have a save the date up there yet. So I'm telling you to save the date, and we hope in the next couple of days we're going to have the save the date up there. But here at the Library of Congress, what we like to do, among other things, is to have book talks. Thank you for joining us again. This is called Books and Beyond, and we feature authors of new books that are of special interest to researchers at the Library of Congress. Often they come out of the collections of the Library of Congress, not so much in today's case with Roger Ekirch, but nonetheless, Roger has yet another important connection to the library. He is related to one of our staff members, which is not why he's here. Roger was here for an earlier book, and we just established that was in 2005, and I'm going to say a word about it, and I think he may as well. We will be taping this for further broadcast on our website, so please turn off all things electronic. If you have any questions during the question and answer period, which will precede the book signing, which will take place out in the foyer, you're giving us permission to use your questions and your image by asking your question. And finally, we will have this question and answer period shortly after Roger speaks. We're very glad to have him back. Roger went to school in Dartmouth. He graduated with honors and has his MA and his PhD from Johns Hopkins. He's been teaching history and is now a professor of history at Virginia Tech, and he's been there since 1977. Roger has written a number of books. His specialty is actually colonial America, but as evidenced by today's book, the one he'll be talking about today, he's interested in European history as well. One of his early books was Bound for America, The Transportation of British Convicts to the Colonies, 1718 to 1775, which was published in 1987. But when he spoke in this series earlier, on June 20th, I looked it up, 2005, it was for a very interesting book that's gotten a lot of attention. At Day's Close, the ending of the day, At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, a study of sleep and the research about what happens in medieval times and earlier times about sleeping. And I think that book was published by Norton in 2005, just before we had him as a speaker. And it's been fun to see what kind of an interesting reception that book has gotten in the scientific community. And I thought of that when we invited Roger for this talk, because again, what an interesting and unusual subject he's chosen this time, one more time. And he said he would be talking about a little bit about the choice of his topic and how he picked up another interesting topic. The book is Birthright, the true story that inspired Kidnapped. And it will be for sale, as I said, and you'll have a chance to talk with him in the signing session. We also, out back where we have the signing, we have the Center for the Book's schedule of future talks. We have a notice about a new feature for this series. we're on Facebook. You can learn about what is coming up and find out comments that people have made about past talks on Facebook as well. So we are trying to get with it here at the Center for the Book. Without further ado, I'd like to present Roger Ekirch to talk about Birthright. Roger, let's give him a hand.
Thank you, John, for your kind words. Nearly 30 years ago, I had the good fortune of being selected a Paul Mellon Fellow at Cambridge University. In truth, the Cambridge history faculty was at that time appealing to my mentor at Johns Hopkins to accept a permanent professorship. So I've always wondered, quite honestly, if being one of his former graduate students helped to influence my appointment. As things turned out, my mentor, in the end, did not accept the offer, but I had an absolute terrific year. All the more because I was invited to reside at Peterhouse, the oldest college, the smallest, and arguably the most traditional at Cambridge, which, alas, to my detriment, also happened to feature the best kitchen and the largest wine cellar in all of Cambridge. I was made a fellow commoner at Peterhouse, a very arcane title used primarily in the Middle Ages for students of gentle birth, neither of which, in my case, applied. For all intents and purposes, I was considered a visiting fellow, with all the privileges of dining at high table and afterwards drinking port, smoking cigars, and taking snuff in the senior combination room. My black gown, unlike those of ordinary fellows, however, was embroidered with thick bands of gold lace on the sleeves. What made this all the more memorable, did I mention it was an absolutely terrific year, was that the legendary historian Hugh Trevor Roper had just been appointed master of the college shortly after being named Lord Dacre following the endorsement of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Trevor Roper's appointment at Peterhouse was, I have learned, designed in part to help liberalize the college, which might tell you something about its staunchly conservative character. Rarely, I suspect, had the new master ever been thought a closet progressive. By all counts, he was a very formidable, if not at times acerbic intellect, though I hasten to add that he treated me over the course of the year with considerable kindness, indeed great kindness. Except that is on one occasion. Typically, the fellows of the college followed the master into the dining hall at dinner time to take their seats at high table, which literally stood atop a platform elevated a foot or two above the main floor where the students ate. Not for a week or more after my arrival did I discover that virtually everyone, including the most senior dons, kept to the rear as Lord Dacre proceeded to lead the way, with the consequence that I invariably found myself pushed to the front and seated to his right at the head of the table. What passed for small talk over dinner was expected to exhibit one's wit. What at its worst approached a blood sport, what at its best was an exhibition of dry, biting humor, occasionally at someone else's expense. At this, I was a complete and utter failure, with the consequence that I would struggle desperately, especially during those first evenings, to find suitable topics of conversation. Finally, one night, having exhausted all other possibilities, I happened to ask the master what project was he currently working on, which seemed like an innocent enough query, the sort of thing that American academics routinely inquire of their colleagues. In a soft but unmistakably firm voice, Lord Dacre informed me that this was a matter that authors, said he, rarely deign to discuss. Well, once I had barely avoided choking on a slice of venison, rescued by a quick gulp of claret, the master's gentle rebuke struck me as a very strange response. I'd like to claim that I proceeded that very same night to digress upon my own research, though I will say that I did mention several facets of it over dinner the following week, though thereby no doubt mortally wounding whatever standing I might otherwise have had as a card-carrying scholar. The fact of the matter is, I've always enjoyed talking about my work, foolishly thinking that others might just find it as interesting as I have, whether it be early American riots, the banishment of British convicts to Virginia and Maryland, the world of nighttime during the centuries preceding the Industrial Revolution, or more recently, the real-life saga that inspired Robert Louis Stevenson's beloved adventure tale, Kidnapped. I can fairly say that I rarely talk about such matters in my courses at Virginia Tech, believing as I do that students represent a captive audience whose hard-earned money should not subject them to a professor's pet passions, especially given the very highly specialized nature of most academic research these days. But presumably, all of you this afternoon are here by your own volition, either as guests or members of the staff of this magnificent institution. No money has changed hands, not yet anyway. You've been forewarned of the day's topic, and you have elected to attend nonetheless. As such, I regret that you will have to put up with me for the remainder of the hour, as did many years ago the late master of Peterhouse, Lord Dacre, probably far more often than he would have preferred. In all seriousness, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon, and special thanks to John and his colleagues for inviting me. It's always a thrill to return to the Library of Congress, where I can truly say I have conducted research for every book that I have written over the course of my career. On St. Valentine's Day in 1945, with the Second World War nearly over, the aspiring novelist Patrick O'Brian, today regarded as one of the greatest writers ever of historical fiction, acquired in a bookstore in London on Charing Cross Road an antiquated volume of the Gentleman's Magazine. Published in 1744, the volume briefly recounted the sensational ordeal of an orphan child named James Annesley, or Jemmy, as he had been known to friends and family. The presumptive heir to 5 aristocratic titles and sprawling estates in England, Ireland, and Wales, Annesley had been kidnapped from Dublin in 1728 at the age of 12 and shipped by his uncle Dick to America. Only after 12 more years as a servant in northern Delaware did he successfully escape, ultimately returning to Ireland to bring his blood rival, now the Earl of Anglesea, to justice in one of the epic struggles of the 18th century. Wicked uncle, kidnapped heir, bastards, sudden death, very gratifying, Patrick O'Brian later recorded in his diary. No saga of personal hardship so captivated the British public in the 18th century as did Annesley's turbulent life. The common topic of conversation, as one contemporary put it, of coffee houses and sitting rooms on both sides of the Irish Sea for over 2 decades following his homecoming. With slight exaggeration, a London writer reflected, starting from the low and ignominious state of a slave, he at once engrossed the attention of the 3 kingdoms of England, Ireland, and Scotland, more, I believe, than any private man ever did. But was James, in fact, scion of the mighty house of Annesley, or, as his enemies insisted, the bastard son of a common house servant? And how, in an age bereft of paternity tests, fingerprint files, and DNA laboratories, could a prodigal who had been missing for over a decade, how could he hope to reclaim his birthright in a court of law? Reclaim it, I might add, from an extraordinarily powerful and dangerous adversary. This extraordinary tale has over the years inspired at least 5 novels, including Sir Walter Scott's Guy Mannering, and even more famously, as I've mentioned, Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Set either in Ireland or in Scotland, these narratives have invariably revolved around the dramatic abduction of a young heir for the purpose not of extorting ransom, but of usurping the lad's patrimony. It may seem strange, by contrast, that historians have largely ignored Annesley's remarkable saga, though reasons for scholarly indifference are actually not that hard to find. To begin with, the principal source associated with Jemmy's abduction was, I should say, the principal known source was a volume first published in 1743 upon his return to Ireland, entitled Memoirs of an Unfortunate Young Nobleman Returned from a 13-Year Slavery in America. Reprinted innumerable times, the volume is easily dismissed as sentimental fiction, written as it was in an age when overblown stories of high adventure were a popular literary genre. Were the protagonist, who was modeled loosely after Jemmy Annesley, of humble origins and a roguish bent, the style might in fact be labeled picaresque, not unlike that of Defoe's Moll Flanders or Fielding's Tom Jones. I first encountered Annesley's purported memoirs, of which he was indubitably not the author, 25 years ago, when researching a book about the banishment, as John mentioned, banishment of British convicts during the 1700s. My instinctive reaction was much the same as that of other historians, to dismiss the volume out of hand as bad fiction, or I meant to say as fiction, and bad fiction at that. By the time of this first encounter, in fact, a reprint had recently been put out as part of Garland Publishing's series devoted to early British novels. So if anything, that only seemed to confirm my strong suspicions. That Annesley's tale has gone untold cannot, however, solely be attributed to the false scent left by a fanciful Georgian narrative, especially considering the publication in 1912 of a transcript of the climactic trial in Dublin between James and his uncle, followed, beginning in the 1960s, by several short articles devoted to different aspects of Annesley's life, written by the late Lillian de la Torre, a prolific mystery writer. Those articles notwithstanding, which did appear in literary journals, the larger story of James Annesley has invariably failed to draw scholarly attention. For the answer also lies, I think, in the predilections of most academic historians. For social and cultural historians who dominate most history departments today, the principal appeal of Annesley's life, if it has any at all, would be limited not to the dramatic events or to the characters themselves, but to the backdrop of 18th century Ireland. In short, what might Annesley's tale have to say about Irish society and culture, especially the roles played by class, religion, and gender? More surprising, perhaps, is that popular historians writing for a broad audience have not themselves been drawn to a plot awash in venality and violence. After all, the tale was sufficiently dramatic to capture the interests of Scott and Stevenson. How could they and three other novelists be wrong? Not to mention the studios of Walt Disney, which employed a similar formula by pitting an orphaned lion cub, Simba, against his wicked Uncle Scar in the enormously successful movie The Lion King, followed, of course, shortly afterwards by the even more successful Broadway production. But alas, for popular historians, the events recounted in my book, Birthright, possess, I think, at least two fatal flaws. Not only are the antagonists lacking in intrinsic importance, but the Annesley saga, however remarkable, left little lasting imprint on the historical landscape. Although Jemmy's abduction represented an unprecedented act of treachery and an extraordinary family drama that unfolded over 7 decades, the fall of the House of Annesley had no discernible impact upon the past. And unlike the aftershocks of revolutions, battlefield heroics, and presidential elections, there's not much of a footprint that was left. Nor, to be honest, does this story throw new light on the momentous events of that era, be they wars for empire, scientific discoveries, or the origins of the Industrial Revolution. Following the return of young Annesley to Dublin in 1743, the Irish Parliament did pass legislation designed to curtail the kidnapping of paupers, but the bill was overruled at the behest of officials in London. Kidnapping was destined to remain for many years under the common law a misdemeanor, whereas horse theft, a felony, was punishable by death. Apart from providing fodder for 19th century novelists, the only other tangible legacy lies in Annesley's courtroom contests. 2 trials in particular established legal landmarks, one in the pioneering use of forensic evidence, whereas the other all but gutted the principle of attorney-client privilege, a ruling that would dominate British jurisprudence for another half-century. So such, then, is the thin gruel that these events offer 2 very different sets of historians. Those, on the one hand, who fill the shelves of bookshops, and others of a more academic bent who deride the penchant of popular historians for chronicling the deeds of dead white men, including, presumably, the shenanigans of British aristocrats. 14 years ago, the celebrated Canadian author Margaret Atwood described her goals in writing historical fiction. Such stories, she observed, are not about this or that slice of the past, or this or that political or social event, or this or that city or country or nationality. Although, of course, all of these may enter into the picture and often do. They are, she continued, about human nature, which usually means they are about pride, envy, avarice, lust, sloth, gluttony, and anger. But also, if less often, added Atwood, such qualities as love, forgiveness, and charity. More recently, the equally renowned Yale historian John Demos has urged scholars to set a similar task in their own studies, albeit by drawing directly upon the hard evidence of the past. In short, to compose, hopefully, compelling narratives that reveal the human condition in all of its complexity, the difference between this and historical fiction being that the past does, after all, enjoy the virtue of being more authentic. In truth, the approach favored by Atwood and Demos incorporates the strengths, I think, of both popular and academic historians. To be sure, academic historians, in their efforts to analyze patterns of human behavior, more often look at bodies of people, be they voting blocs, social classes, or ethnic groups. By contrast, Demos and Atwood, in their attempts to fathom the foundations of human nature, are more concerned with individuals, which may or may not involve the writing of biographies. But this, in my view, is a subtle, dare one say, academic distinction. The point being that Atwood and Demos share with most scholars a desire to plumb the depths of humanity in whatever guise or form. Their methodology, on the other hand, is more in keeping with popular authors by favoring well-told stories, replete with individuals capable of inspiring in readers anger and disgust, as well as admiration, affection, and even, on rare occasions, a measure of awe. So that if one of my aims as a long-standing social historian in resurrecting the saga of James Annesley has been to illuminate Irish society, I set out mainly to write a narrative, not unlike the novels of Margaret Atwood that would hopefully capture the imagination of readers. Let me underscore that this was my goal, not necessarily the desired consequence, which will be up to readers, obviously, to decide for themselves. Fortunately, at least, the documentary evidence for this project proved to be both broad and deep. 7 years ago, in the course of researching the book at day's close, a stray reference to Annesley's tribulations in an obscure English diary in Oxford's Bodleian Library caused me to probe further, only to discover transcripts of court proceedings held in London as well as in Dublin. And two, along with numerous newspaper reports, I was fortunate enough to locate nearly 400 legal depositions in the National Library of Ireland in Dublin and in the British National Archives outside London. Although few scraps of personal correspondence have survived, members of the Annesley family, given their penchant for confrontation, left behind a vast trove of legal documents. The sheer density of the depositions, many containing richly detailed recollections of rural Ireland in the 1700s, is absolutely stunning. They speak not only of the minutiae of everyday existence, the clothing, the furnishings, the customs of lords and peasants, but also of the rhythms of Irish life. But again, most importantly, from my perspective, the depositions offered invaluable information relating to James Annesley's remarkable youth. I should emphasize that the Annesley family was scarcely the only noble house in the British Isles to be racked by internal discord. By the 18th century, many family dynasties, once united by bonds of kinship and clientage, had given way instead to nuclear households comprising parents, children, and a small ring of close relatives. Legal quarrels, especially rival claims over inheritance, were not uncommon among distant relations. Lamented a Dublin writer in 1734, when kinsfolk are a degree or two removed, they grow perfectly indifferent to each other and come to forget all mutual regards. The Annesleys, however, fought the bulk of their battles at close quarters. A number of circumstances fueled their clashes, not least a shortage of male heirs schooled in putting the long-term interests of the family above their own personal well-being. The ferocity of the family's clashes over rank and wealth rather than theology or political dogma cut to its very core, pitting husband against wife, father against son, and brother against brother. Jemmy's abduction by his uncle Dick was only the most brazen act of treachery, neither the first nor surely the final breach of trust in this protracted family drama. Ultimately, Birthright is a story about betrayal and loss, but also, I like to think about endurance, resilience, and redemption. Certainly no author could wish for a more colorful cast of characters, from a brave Dublin butcher and a shrewd Scottish merchant to the King of England, George II. A personal favorite of mine is an elderly widow named Anstice O'Connor, who in 1742 confronted the Earl of Anglesea, a.k.a. Uncle Dick, for having kidnapped his nephew. Decades earlier, Anstice had peddled oysters at Dunmayne, the country seat in County Wexford, where James in 1715 had been born. "The people are moaning," she protested to the Earl, "because a great many here say you transported him overseas." Startled, Anglesea snapped, "No, you fool, hold your tongue." After regaining his composure, the Earl offered £40 if she'd swear that Jemmy was an illegitimate son, which Anstice adamantly refused, adding that she would not, and I quote, "take such an oath for all the world." But of course, center stage in the book is occupied by the Annesleys themselves, an English family who, during the course of the 1600s, had achieved wealth and fame in Ireland on a grand scale. Apart from personal tenacity and ambition, their rise owed much to Ireland's dramatically transformed social order. Following a new wave of English conquest in the late 16th century, Protestant adventurers like Captain Robert Annesley, the younger son of a gentry family in England, laid claim to confiscated Catholic estates, culminating in an Anglo-Irish upper class that historians have since labeled the Protestant ascendancy. Subsequent generations of the family included Robert's grandson, Arthur Annesley, whom Charles II in 1682 made the first Earl of Anglesea. The Earl was a figure of considerable learning and culture, adopting, ironically, the motto, "with love of virtue," for the family's coat of arms. An acquaintance of John Locke and a patron of the poet Andrew Marvell, the Earl of Anglesea boasted the largest private library in Britain, not to mention vast estates in Ireland and England at the time of his death in 1686. So that by any measure, wealth, honor, power, these first generations laid a formidable foundation for the family's future success. No aristocratic house at the end of the 17th century could have expected more from its forebears. Equally important, seemingly there was no apparent shortage of male heirs, at least that is at first. Owing, however, to high rates of infant mortality, the family's honors and estates, rather than descending directly on the main stem of the genealogical tree, were forced by the fifth generation to fork sideways to a remote bough, one that happened to be inhabited by Arthur Lord Altham, an impoverished baron and the future father of James Annesley. In 1708, at 19 years of age, Baron Altham had abandoned his wife Mary in London and absconded to Ireland, where he owned land in County Wexford. A short, homely man of slight build with gray eyes and black eyebrows, he delighted in low pleasures. Best expressed, perhaps, upon offering a servant future employment. "If you come to live with me," promised the baron, "you shall never want a shilling in your pocket, a gun to foul, a horse to ride, or a whore." The offer was accepted. In time, Altham reconciled with his wife, long enough at least to guarantee the birth of a male heir, James, in 1715. 3 years later, however, the baron falsely charged Mary with adultery. "It's true she bore him," he stormed, "and that's all the pleasure she shall have of him," having sent her off in a coach, never again to return to their home at Dunmayne. Not only was Lord Altham shortly charged with corruption by the Irish House of Lords, but he turned James out at 8 years of age to fend for himself in the streets of Dublin. When taken to task for abandoning his son, the baron blamed his mistress, to whom he had become very deeply indebted. "That bitch," he protested, "will not suffer me to do anything for him." Despite Altham's mysterious death in 1727 at age 38, no one, not surprisingly perhaps, felt sufficiently concerned to investigate the circumstances. But of course, the central protagonists of the book are James, the orphan son, and his uncle Dick, Lord Altham's younger brother, who, in addition to being a serial bigamist, was, if anything, more rapacious, the consequence, perhaps, of being a younger son with neither rank nor financial security. By one account, Richard was of middling height and bore the clumsy manner of a country farmer. Unfortunately, no known portrait has survived, nor was he, or for that matter, his older brother, the sort to sit for one. Owing to Richard's appearance and character, a female acquaintance later volunteered, "I would not have had him if I was young, no, not even to be a countess." Just 3 weeks before Baron Altham's death, the older brother, in November of 1727, Richard had paid his young nephew a visit at the home of John Purcell, a warm-hearted butcher who, together with his wife, had taken James into their Dublin home. "Do you," Richard asked the butcher, "have a boy in the house named James Annesley?" "Yes," replied Purcell, calling the lad hesitantly from the fireside, once and then a second time. Stricken with fear, his eyes beginning to moisten, Jemmy whispered to Mammy, the name he had given Purcell's wife, "That is my Uncle Dick." The boy's fears were well-founded. Shortly after having, I think, his brother poisoned, Richard sought to remove this final obstacle to Altham's title, along with 4 more peerages that Jemmy, in a short space of years, stood to inherit. On April 30th, 1728, the boy was grabbed in Dublin's Ormond Market, bundled into a coach, transported to George's Quay on the south side of the River Liffey, and carried aboard a vessel brimming with servants bound for Newcastle, Delaware. That Jemmy Annesley then survived 12 years in northern Delaware as an indentured servant was a testament to his resilience. Unlike immigrants who sought to make new lives in the colonies, he held fast to his identity. At the same time, he had an outward ability to adapt to different settings and new hardships. Instability had, after all, been for a long time a way of life. If anything, it may have eased his adjustment to the plight of a servant, however punishing the ordeal and however wrenching his separation from Ireland. Upon Jemmy's flight as a runaway servant, successfully absconding on his 3rd attempt to Jamaica, then London, and finally to Ireland, his Uncle Dick, now the 6th Earl of Anglesea, repeatedly tried to have him killed as the two commenced a titanic struggle lasting 2 decades in and out of court on both sides of the Irish Sea. Never before had 5 peerages in such an immense estate been at the disposal of the British legal system. By one account, the property was worth at least £50,000 a year, which in today's prices comes roughly to slightly more than £5 million per annum. No less momentous in the public mind were allegations of aristocratic wrongdoing, which for James's following had robbed a peer of the realm of his birthright and broken the chain of succession within the house of Annesley. Uncle Dick's circle, by contrast, bewailed the prospect of elevating a false claimant, or so they contended, to the family's honors, not unlike Jacobite efforts at that time to place a Stuart heir on the throne of England. In fact, opponents commonly derided Jemmy as a quote-unquote pretender, the slur attached to successive generations of Stuart claimants. Annesley's contest claimed Viscount Percival, in a letter from Dublin to his father, was, and I quote, perhaps of greater importance than any trial ever known in this or any other kingdom. As to whether the young claimant finally achieved justice, for that, I'm afraid, you will need to read the book. We're running out of time. Suffice to say that it's a tale of truly unforeseen twists and turns that even persisted after the deaths of both Jemmy and his treacherous uncle. Revenge, as the 19th century French proverb goes, is a dish that is best served cold, even in the case of Jemmy Annesley from the grave. Thank you very much.
We have time for a question or two.
By all means. I'm sorry to run on for so long. Yes, sir.
If I just say, hopefully two just short ones. First off, what was the precedent of attorney-client privilege that resulted from all this? And two, why didn't the uncle just have him killed outright?
I've wondered that. The problem is that the boy was sufficiently well known, both to others in the family and to Baron Altham's associates. Whereas to claim, one of the incriminating circumstances is that Uncle Dick had a different explanation depending upon who he talked to. He did claim at one point that he died of smallpox. Another time he claimed that he was enlisted voluntarily as a servant to Jamaica. And still another version of that set of events was that he died then as an indentured servant. The Irish, even though Ireland was viewed by England in much the same denigrating fashion as was colonial America, the Irish had a far more, they separated themselves. They made a distinction between Irish civility and certainly the Pale of Ireland, the neighborhood of Dublin and Dublin itself, from the wilds of America. So I guess the short answer to your question is consigning him to indentured servitude was nearly tantamount to a death sentence anyway. And in fact, he took no chances. Typical indentured servant signed voluntarily to serve for 3 to 5 years. His uncle signed a contract for 7 years. And because he repeatedly tried to run away, that's why he ended up serving at least a dozen years. The other part of your question was, I'm sorry.
The precedent set with regard to attorney-client privilege.
Yes, that there is none. And especially the attorneys have an obligation, if something nefarious is underway, to report said misdemeanor or felony to a justice. In this case, it involved an attempt by Uncle Dick upon Jemmy's return to London before returning to Dublin to frame him for murder. And his solicitor was fully informed of this. The Earl of Anglesea, in a remarkable statement to the solicitor, said, if it takes £12,000, I will have him hanged. And yet another twist, by the time of this momentous trial in 1743 in Dublin, the solicitor has come over to Jemmy's following and testifies against his longtime client. And that's what precipitated a ruling from the Court of Exchequer in Dublin.
So the precedent, I mean, in our vernacular, lawyers are still officers of the court. I mean, they are still responsible to the court for reporting crimes. And say, this is...
They had a very nebulous role at this point. Only recently had they begun to appear either in Ireland or in England in court and allowed to represent their clients. for the longest time, prosecution, in fact, was up to the victim to undertake, to pay all the expenses and virtually to interrogate his or her antagonist in court. Only were prosecutors enlisted during the 18th century, with defense attorneys then to keep the scales balanced added shortly thereafter. Yes?
Are you familiar with the case of Peter Williamson in Aberdeen in Scotland shortly before this?
Yes, I'm familiar with the story.
And does that have the legal proceedings there? I'm not sure about the date sequence, but did that have any impact on this case?
No. In fact, they operated on pretty much separate tracks. There's a very good article for anyone who's interested. Peter Williamson, of course, was another. He wasn't of gentle birth, but he was forced across the Atlantic, and very good article that appeared on his plight in the William and Mary Quarterly less than a year ago. Yes.
I was wondering in your research if you came across the influence of this case perhaps on a movie, a 1948 movie with Alec Guinness, Crowns and Coronations, in which a member of the peerage knocks off 8 relatives who stand in the way of him in a title.
No.
It's a wonderful dark comedy, and it sounded as you were telling this story that perhaps that was.
No, but I'll check it out. I'm reluctant to claim that this was the precedent or inspiration for too many. Alas, there's enough in British history, I'm sure, to have inspired that, completely independent of this story. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we've never actually met, though we've emailed, we might have an heir of the Annesley, or at least a member of the Annesley family in the audience. Thank you very much for coming. Introduce yourself.
My name is Stuart Kern, and what we know is that our immigrant ancestor was William Annesley, circa 1800.
Stuart, would you come up and just maybe stand at the podium for a second and start again? I'd appreciate it.
And Stuart Kern, and I live in Silver Spring right now. Our immigrant ancestor, William Annesley, immigrated from Belfast circa 1800. And in the family, also in the 1970s, from time to time we'd get to look through my grandmother's, through a big chest in my grandmother's living room that included the 1744 Dublin transcript of the trial. It included Adventures of a Young Nobleman in all 3 volumes, and included the murder trial of James Annesley. So this was all part of the family history. Oh, and Charles Reade's novel, The Wandering Heir, but never Smollett or Swift. And
I would just add, you may not, I don't know if I mentioned this in an email or not, but it is possible, admittedly a slim possibility, that there is a living heir who, I don't want to give away the story, but suffice to say that if there is a descendant of James Annesley alive today, and he did have children, including a daughter who married the captain of a slave ship. Whether they have children or not, I honestly don't know, but it is possible. I've run this by 2 very kind members of the House of Lords with judicial backgrounds in London, and it is possible, I think, that the title, at least, the Earl of Anglesea, the jewel in the crown, could have descended through James's daughter, if there is, given the nature of these things, a male heir alive today. And there is a committee in the House of Lords that is specifically charged with adjudicating such cases. The problem is that you have to have a living heir. You have to have a living heir. So, Stuart, I don't know if
whether it could be me. All we know is that the Annesleys had an art gallery in Albany and tremendous history here. But William Annesley had two daughters who had never married, and they went through his papers sometime in the 1800s and determined that all of his whatever was in those papers was tremendously scandalous, and they burned it all. Except for these couple of transcripts. So that's as much of our link to the Annesleys right now that we know.
Very nice. I'm glad you came. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, history has come alive right here at the Library of Congress. Well, Roger, Ekirch, and Stuart, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation, Roger. We appreciate it, and you'll have a chance to buy the book and chat a little more about the mysteries that have come to us today at the book signing out in the foyer. Let's give everyone a round of applause. Roger.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.